The heat of the mid-morning sun hammered down on the dusty thoroughfare of Black Ridge, creating shimmering mirages that distorted the horizon and made the distant mesas look like they were melting into the earth. Maylin sat rigid on the buckboard seat of the weathered wagon, her hands folded tightly in her lap to hide the tremors that threatened to betray her terror. She wore a dress of plain blue cotton, a stark departure from the silk she had known in her former life. But it was not the fabric that chafed her skin. It was the weight of the stares that bore into her from every porch and window. She had traveled across an ocean, and then halfway across a savage continent, sold on a promise of stability that now looked like nothing more than a cruel joke. Beside her sat the man she was now bound to, a man named Cole. He was a silent, monolithic figure, his hat pulled low over eyes that seemed to absorb everything while revealing nothing. His clothes were worn, stained with the red dust of the territory, and the wagon they rode in creaked with the pathetic groan of rotting wood. To anyone watching, and indeed to Maylin herself, he looked like a destitute drifter, a man scraping the bottom of the barrel in a land that devoured the weak. As the wagon rattled past the saloon, the distinct sound of laughter erupted from the shadows of the overhang. A group of men, leaning idly against the railing, pointed openly at the mismatched pair. Maylin kept her eyes fixed forward, refusing to give them the satisfaction of her fear, but she saw Cole's jaw tighten, a subtle ripple of muscle that vanished as quickly as it appeared. He did not turn his head. He did not acknowledge the jeers. He simply flicked the reins, his hands rough and scarred, guiding the tired horses with a strange, gentle precision that contradicted his rugged appearance. "Keep your eyes up," Cole murmured, his voice a low gravel that barely rose above the sound of the wheels grinding against the dirt. "They smell fear like blood in the water. Don't give it to them." It was the most he had spoken in 3 hours. Maylin glanced at him, searching for some sign of reassurance, but his profile was carved from stone, indifferent to the humiliation of their arrival. She felt a cold pit of despair open in her stomach. She had expected a hard life, yes, but she had expected a husband with a farm, perhaps a modest plot of land where corn or wheat struggled toward the sun. Instead, she was attached to a man who seemed to own nothing but the dust on his boots and a wagon that threatened to collapse with every revolution of its wheels. The town behind them faded into a haze of heat, but the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, clung to her skin like the grit of the road. The journey out of town took them through a landscape that was both majestic and desolate, a sprawling expanse of scrub brush and jagged rock formations that seemed to stretch into eternity. The spring wildflowers were blooming, bursting with violent purples and yellows against the red earth, but Maylin could find no beauty in them, only the vast emptiness of her future. They traveled for hours, the sun climbing to its zenith and then beginning its slow descent, casting long, bruised shadows across the trail. Cole remained silent, his eyes constantly scanning the ridgelines, his posture relaxed yet alert, like a predator feigning sleep. It was late afternoon when he finally slowed the horses, turning the wagon off the main trail onto a barely visible path that wound its way up a steep, rocky incline. The wagon lurched violently, and Maylin had to grab the bench to steady herself, her heart pounding against her ribs. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice thin in the dry air. "Home," Cole replied, the word landing with a heaviness she couldn't interpret. They crested the ridge and the property came into view. Maylin's breath hitched, but not from awe. It was a ruin. A small, leaning shack sat isolated in a patch of dry dirt, surrounded by a broken fence that wouldn't have kept out a stray dog, let alone a wolf. The roof was patched with mismatched timber, and the windows were dark, gaping holes that stared back at her like the eyes of a skull. This was it. This was the life she had been sold into. A sob caught in her throat, sharp and painful, but she swallowed it down. She was a survivor. She had survived the crossing, the auction block, and the journey west. she would survive this desolate patch of dirt, too. Cole brought the wagon to a halt in front of the shack and set the brake. He didn't look at her, didn't offer an apology for the squalor. He simply hopped down, his boots kicking up a cloud of dust, and began unhitching the horses. Maylin climbed down slowly, her legs stiff, and looked around the perimeter. It was quiet, disturbingly so. But as she watched Cole work, she noticed something that didn't fit the narrative of the poor, broken farmer. He moved with an efficiency that was almost military. He checked the cinches, checked the hooves, and then, with a casual motion that was too smooth to be accidental, he adjusted the heavy revolver on his hip. It was a pristine weapon, the metal gleaming and well-oiled, a stark contrast to the poverty of the shack. It was the first breadcrumb of a mystery she was too exhausted to solve. The interior of the shack was as bleak as the exterior promised. A single room, dusty and stiflingly hot, with a cast-iron stove in the corner and a narrow cot pushed against the wall. The air smelled of stale smoke and neglect. Maylin stood in the center of the room, her small travel bag clutched in her hand, feeling the walls closing in on her. Cole entered behind her, carrying a crate of supplies. He set it down on the warped table without a word. "It's not much," he said, and for the first time she detected a note of something else in his voice. Not shame exactly, but a guarded, almost testing quality. "It's a roof," she replied, her voice steady, refusing to let him see her disappointment. She set her bag down and immediately began to survey the room for what could be done. She would not weep. She would work. Cole watched her for a moment, his dark eyes tracking her movements as she rolled up her sleeves. He seemed to be measuring her, calculating her resilience against some invisible standard. "There's water in the barrel out back," he said, turning toward the door. "I have to check the perimeter before dark." Maylin paused. Perimeter? The word felt too tactical for a man living in a shack in the middle of nowhere. "Coyotes," he said shortly, but the way his hand hovered near his holster suggested he was worried about two-legged predators, not four. He stepped out into the dying light, leaving her alone in the gloom. As she began to sweep the floor with a makeshift broom she found in the corner, her mind raced. The poverty was real enough, the dirt, the lack of furniture, the meager food supplies, but the man didn't fit the setting. He didn't walk like a beaten man. He walked like a man who owned the ground beneath his feet, even if that ground appeared to be worthless. She found a loose floorboard near the stove and pried it up, hoping to find a cellar or some storage, but found only packed earth. However, in the dirt, something glinted. She reached down and pulled out a shell casing. It wasn't old and rusted. It was fresh brass. She turned it over in her fingers, the metal cool against her skin. Why would a poor farmer need to expend expensive ammunition in his own home? The sound of Cole's boots on the porch made her shove the casing into her pocket, her heart racing with a sudden, undefined suspicion. 2 days later, the reality of their situation became violently clear during a necessary trip back to Black Ridge for supplies. The initial silence of the town had curdled into active hostility. As Cole tied the horses to the rail outside the general store, a group of riders drifted down the main street, their horses kicking up lazy clouds of dust. At the center was a man who radiated the kind of power that comes from unchecked wealth and cruelty. Harrigan. He wore a suit that cost more than Cole's entire wagon, and his smile was a slash of white in a tanned, leathery face. He pulled his horse up alongside them, blocking their path to the store entrance. Maylin instinctively stepped closer to Cole, feeling the sudden drop in temperature despite the midday sun. "Well now," Harrigan drawled, his voice carrying clearly to the gathered onlookers, "if it isn't the squatter and his new purchase. I heard you went and got yourself a bride, Cole. Didn't think you had 2 nickels to rub together." The men around Harrigan chuckled, a low, menacing sound. Cole didn't flinch. He continued to adjust the strap on the saddlebag, his back to Harrigan, a display of disrespect so profound it sucked the air out of the street. "We're just here for flour and nails, Harrigan," Cole said, his voice flat and bored. "Let us pass." Harrigan's smile faltered, replaced by a flash of genuine anger. He leaned down from his saddle, his shadow falling over Maylin. "You're sitting on my land, boy. That scrap of dirt you're clinging to? It's going to be mine, one way or another." He looked at Maylin, his eyes raking over her with disgusting familiarity. "Shame to see a pretty thing like this starve to death out there when I burn you out." Cole turned then. The movement was slow, deliberate. He looked up at Harrigan, and for a second the mask slipped. The poor farmer vanished, and something lethal looked out from Cole's eyes. It was a look of such intense, concentrated violence that Harrigan's horse shied away, sensing the threat, even if its rider was too arrogant to see it fully. "You can try," Cole said softly, "but bring more men." The tension in the air was brittle, ready to snap. Harrigan's hand twitched toward his gun, but he hesitated. There was something in Cole's stillness, a coiled readiness that whispered of a trap. With a sneer, Harrigan wheeled his horse around. "Enjoy the honeymoon," he spat. "It'll be short." As the riders clattered away, Maylin released a breath she didn't know she was holding. Her hands were shaking. She looked at Cole, expecting to see fear, or at least adrenaline. Instead, he was checking the list in his hand as if he had just discussed the weather. "Come on," he said, ushering her into the store. "We need to be back before sunset." Inside the cool, dim interior of the store, surrounded by the smell of coffee beans and leather, Maylin confronted him. "Who is he?" she whispered urgently, glancing at the shopkeeper who was pretending not to listen. "A man who thinks he's a king because he has a big fence," Cole muttered, picking up a sack of flour. "He wants the land? Why?" she pressed. "It's just rocks and dust." Cole paused, his hand resting on the counter. He looked at her, and for the first time she saw a flicker of respect in his eyes. "Because he thinks that's all it is," he said cryptically, "and as long as he thinks that, we have the advantage." The ride back to the shack was grueling, the atmosphere heavy with the threat Harrigan had left hanging in the air. The sun was setting by the time they reached the property line, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and blood red. The shadows stretched long and distorted across the trail, turning every bush and rock into a potential ambush. Maylin sat stiffly, her eyes darting to every movement in the brush. Cole was pushing the horses harder now, the wagon bouncing roughly over the uneven terrain. He wasn't relaxed anymore. His eyes were constantly checking the rear, scanning the ridge, watching the sky. The sense of urgency was palpable. They weren't just going home. They were running for cover. When they finally pulled up to the shack, the darkness was nearly complete. "Get inside," Cole ordered, his voice sharp. "Don't light the lantern yet." Maylin scrambled down and rushed into the shack, the darkness inside feeling less like a shelter and more like a cage. She heard Cole securing the horses, moving with rapid, heavy steps. He entered a moment later, barring the door with a heavy beam she hadn't noticed before. He moved to the window, peering out through the cracks in the shutters, his revolver drawn. "Are they coming tonight?" Maylin asked, her voice trembling. "They're always coming," Cole replied, not looking away from the window. "Harrigan doesn't like to wait." He turned to her then, the moonlight slicing through the slats and illuminating half his face. "I need you to trust me," he said. Things aren't what they look like here. But I can't explain it all yet. Not until I know you can handle it." "Handle what?" she demanded, frustration overriding her fear. "Living in a ruin? Being threatened by tyrants? I handled leaving my home, Cole. I handled the ship. I think I can handle the truth." Cole studied her, silence stretching between them. Then he holstered his gun. He walked over to the corner of the room to a heavy wooden chest that looked like the only solid piece of furniture in the place. He pulled a key from a chain around his neck, a complex, heavy iron key that looked far too sophisticated for a simple lock. He didn't open the chest, though. Instead, he handed the key to her. "Keep this on you," he said. "If anything happens to me, if they come and I'm not here, you take the horse and you ride to the canyon north of here. Use this on the gate." Maylin stared at the key. It was heavy, cold, and intricate.